This workshop recording captures what happened in the main Zoom room for each session. What appears in chat or breakout rooms is not captured in the recording. Each participant and viewer comes to the session with a unique lived experience. Anyone may experience unintentional harm from the viewed content or transcript. Please feel free to pause the recording at any time, to walk away from it, or to take time for self-care or processing. When difficult moments occur during a session, further discussion may happen in debriefs or external communications to attempt to repair and care for those involved. What's included in the recording may not represent that additional work. If you feel impacted or harmed by what you experience, please seek out support from your campus or community resources to care for yourself however you need.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Karen Christ, and I'd like to introduce this session. Today, we're joined by Dr. Jude Bergkamp and Eva Baker of the PsyD program, and I would like to introduce their session, Understanding the BIPOC Faculty Burden, Review and Implications. I also want to highlight that Dr. Kate Everts and maybe others are going to be putting themselves in the chat box as members of our unintentional harm team. So if you have things you would like to process offline, feel free to direct message them. We are asking that we not direct message the people that are presenting, Jude and Eva today. They will not be able to respond, but you can ask questions through the Q&A or the chat feature. And thank you. Let's get going with the session.
Excellent. Thank you. So let me go ahead and do a little share screen. All right. Well, welcome everyone to Understanding the BIPOC Faculty Burden. I am really privileged to be joined by Dr. Baker, who is a research assistant on this project. And by the way, this is a Guskin Grant project from Antioch. And so there's a little disclaimer there. And I also just want to acknowledge Natalie Sridhar, who is also a research fellow for us. Both Natalie and Eva have done an incredible job with this. I just want to acknowledge that right off the bat. So today we'll do a quick kind of social location. We'll just introduce Dr. Baker and I. I'll try to provide a conceptual frame, and then Dr. Baker will really take us through a deep dive of what the literature currently says. Basically today, this is kind of the first step, if you will, in a much larger project, which is basically taking a look at, is there a thing, is there an entity called a phenomenon that we would call the BIPOC faculty burden? Do BIPOC folks who are teaching classes that we would call diversity, multiculturalism, cultural competency, social justice, the terms change over the years, right? But is there a phenomenon in which BIPOC faculty teaching those classes have a specific type of burden that needs to be defined, understood, and in a way honored? And so we will, Dr. Baker will go through overall experiences of BIPOC faculty, and then we'll kind of funnel down to that course. So just for introductions, again, my name is Jude Bergkamp. My status is, I think the reason I'm here wearing this incredible blazer, $15 from Target, by the way, trying to be springy. My status is as the core faculty and chair of the PsyD program at Antioch in Seattle. I've been doing that for about 13 years, thus some of the gray right here on my beard. But I think this was really born, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but this project was really born out of my experience teaching these kinds of classes at Antioch. So as far as what we call rank, if you're familiar with the addressing model from Pamela Hayes, another Antiochian, I basically have what we call, and I'll go over this kind of agent rank across all the identity domains, being cisgender, straight, middle class, able-bodied, US citizen, those sorts of things. My only target rank is as a BIPOC person, a brown guy, biracial. My mother was from India. My dad, a kind of a white farm boy from Kansas. So I think what's calling me here today is really that experience of being biracial and trying to figure out and struggle with what my own identity is. That's the thing that brought me to psychology, but has also caused me to start to have a critical lens of psychology, and in this case, also academia. All right, Dr. Baker, would you like to introduce?
Yep. So I'm Eva Baker. I got my doctorate in 2022, and now I'm a part-time research assistant at the Antioch in Seattle with Jude, and I'm a full-time forensic evaluator for the state of Washington. Similar to Jude, I have a lot of agent ranks: cisgender, middle class, able-bodied, U.S. citizen. Some of my target ranks are I'm biracial, my father's Black, queer, and female. And that's my small introduction.
Great. Thank you, Eva. Appreciate it. All right. So these next set of slides is really to provide somewhat of a framework of terms that and principles that we use in our lab and with this work. So one of the biggest, I think, moments or epiphanies for me is this idea that mostly these classes, diversity, multiculturalism, we'll just call them multicultural classes for short, traditionally, the emphasis has been on helping folks within psychology learn about people who are culturally different than them. And so the curriculum was really focused on these different groups. If folks here were schooled in psychology, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, you're probably familiar with like the Sue and Sue book of the required course. That book basically kind of presents different cultural groups and kind of cultural norms within those groups. Surprisingly, there isn't a chapter, if you will, on the majority group. There is no chapter, let's say, on white folks. And so there's what we call a majority assumption. Over time, what we notice recently is that the curriculum is moving more from culture to issues of structural competency, historical power and oppression, and issues of social privilege. So Goodman has this quote from a talk: while it's critical to understand how some groups are disadvantaged by individuals' behaviors, institutional policies, and cultural norms, that is only one side of the coin of oppression. The other side of the coin is understanding how some groups are advantaged. Looking at both sides presents a clearer picture of how systemic inequality operates and uncovers more opportunities to intervene and create change. So I think this is a pretty major move that's occurred within our curriculum and is the focus of our classes in our program, is that instead of focusing on the other, which will change as clients come and go, we're focusing on the clinician itself, on the psychologist itself as the consistent tool, if you will, or conduit of healing. And so in this way, we're changing really the dominant discourse, I think, of our field and of education, of instead of focusing on the culturally different other, we're focusing on the privileged parts of ourselves. So another kind of foundational concept for us is this idea of disconsciousness from Joyce King. She defines disconsciousness as an uncritical habit of mind that justifies inequality and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things as given. The hegemonic norms that we all disconsciously and socially construct, we agree with. Disconsciousness is an action. It's not a state. Think for yourself about when you were first aware of your own socially conferred privilege. Disconsciousness is basically this move that we make to push that awareness out of our consciousness as to avoid the discomfort and shame that that brings. So the major part in this concept is that these courses inevitably poke holes at the participants' disconscious bubble, if you will. And that is sometimes not welcomed or not wanted, or especially not expected. The ripple effect of poking a hole in our disconscious in order to understand our social privilege it usually does not feel great. I've never known anyone to be like, woohoo, yes, great. So I would just like for us to think a little bit about this ideas of rank versus status, and specifically the confusion between the two. So rank is defined basically as static and pervasive across context, time, place, and relationship. Rank connotes an identity domain, usually occurring by the lottery of our birth, in which historical, institutional, structural, and generational forces have dictated worth, access, safety, and ease of volition or choice. Rank determines if we have privilege or the lack thereof. So as I introduced myself earlier, I have what we call agent rank across many of these things. Me, let's say, and my male privilege stays consistent over time. It does not change. So we also adopt the terms agent and target rank. These terms refer to the privileged or oppressed aspects of our identity domains. While authors in the past have used marginalized, minority, or oppressed as terms for the target, interestingly, it's seldom that there is a clear term to identify how each of us has privileged ranks as agents. So this idea of agent rank is important. So combining these ideas, we basically used Pamela Hayes' addressing model, another Antiochian, by the way. Whoop, whoop. And if you see here, this table provided by Hayes is really a culmination of what some scholars would constitute where we have agent rank or target rank. So status, on the other hand, is dynamic and changing between time, place, context, and relationship. Status can involve interpersonal prejudice and discrimination, as well as temporary or contextual minority positions based on identity domains, but without the historical and institutional underpinning. So what do I mean by this? Well, I would say that I hold agent rank, let's say, as a man. I hold target rank, let's say, as a person of color, according to the Hayes grid. Status, though, on the other hand, connotes mostly my role. As I introduce myself, I'm the chair of a program or I'm faculty. These are high status positions. Right now, I'm wearing this blazer. I'm the one talking. These are all high status moves. But my status versus my rank can be very different. While I can be a faculty that has status power over folks, I also have a target rank as a person of color. And so we want to think about the relationship between status and rank. The caution I would like to give for all of us working anywhere within kind of themes of social justice and academia is this risk that we notice around status rank conflation. So a conflation example could be a white individual saying, I know what oppression or racial oppression is like because I attended a high school where most of the other students were BIPOC, and I was one of the only white folks. So I know what that's like. Well, it might be true that that person experienced a little prejudice or discrimination, but it did not have the gravity of our colonial history, institutional mechanisms at play, and these structural competency sorts of issues that come up. Another one might be that a person who identifies as a man works in a field like mental health or something, where mostly we work with folks who identify as women. That again is a temporary minority position. So in other words, I hold my agent rank as a man, and I have some status as a faculty. But when I leave school and let's say go to the airport security line, then, or let's say the used car lot, my faculty status goes away, but my male privilege stays. In a flip side, I could leave school and I would lose that status power, but then I take with me my target rank as a person of color. So in regards to the BIPOC faculty burden, the status rank conflation is that we could focus too much on the status power an individual has as faculty and negate or not recognize their target rank as a person of color.
Jude, we're going to have to go back to this at the end.
Okay. How do you mean?
Like timing wise, we're going to have to go back to that at the end.
Okay.
This slide.
Okay. I'll follow you. Okay. Thanks. So the reason or the inspiration for this is basically, like I mentioned before, I've been teaching this class for 13 years. As things have changed and as my focus has changed, what I notice is, Eva, is this good? Is this what you're saying? Do you want me to
No, I'm saying we need to go back to it to the end, like start with the next slide.
Okay, I'll flip. All right. So thank you, Dr. Baker. I'm now going to hand it over to her. Here we go.
So to give some perspective about like the population that we're talking about, you can see from the first bullet point and the picture, it's about 24-25% are going to be BIPOC faculty in institutions. But that number doesn't account for what kind of positions those are within faculty, which is important to highlight because we're thinking about, the different levels of positions, like how high those positions are, but also tenure track versus non-tenure track faculty. And so what we know is that BIPOC faculty are underrepresented in higher level positions, overrepresented in non-paid and voluntary roles. And then when we think about tenure track, 70% of all positions are going to be tenure track positions. And faculty of color make up 19% of the non-tenure track workforce, but women of color are overrepresented in that population and make up about 41% of those positions. BIPOC people and white women are less likely to hold prestigious positions than white men, and that's going to be compounded with intersectional identities. So women of color account for 10% of all faculty members, which breaks down to about 4% Asian women, 3% Black women, 2% Latina women, and then Native American women and women of two different races represent 1% or less each. You go to the next slide. Next slide. There you go. Okay. So also to give context to the institution at large and the academy, first we have to think about the impacts of neoliberalism and the society and the political society that we live in. And so these tenets, consumerism, competitive individualism, surveillance, all of these things lead to excessive and unreasonable demands on faculty, because faculty are trying to produce, right? You're trying to generate revenue because that is what's rewarded in this society. You're being surveilled because you have to report all your citations, your research, your funding, all of these things every year. I mean, all these things lead to hyper competition amongst scholars, and then barriers to work that actually advance equity, because you're so concerned with generating revenue, making sure you're better than your other scholars, and you're trying to maximize this productivity, these outputs, rather than work that could create equity and change. And then also the added ramification of the academy. It was an exclusively white institution. That's how it was built. That's how it was designed. So entering these spaces are going to be emotionally hazardous. And then there's also the hidden curriculum of tenure. Because we've been excluded from all of these positions, there's just information we don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And so there's barriers to formal leadership positions and lack of institutional support. You can go to the next slide. So to give context about the BIPOC faculty burden, what we're calling it, it was originally coined in 1994, and it was called the cultural tax. And this was basically what they called for the tasks and situations that were imposed upon you because of your race or ethnicity, because of your presumed knowledge of cultural differences, or your status as a person of color. In 2011, this was expanded upon, and it was called the identity taxation to recognize the impacts of intersectionality and how other marginalized identities are impacted. And so basically the cultural tax, the diversity tax, the BIPOC faculty burden is this invisible labor that's unpaid, unrecognized, and unacknowledged. Even when these things are acknowledged or recognized, it's seen as service, and service is not valued as much as research or teaching. And it's important to remember that when I start talking about all these things, these are the added things that BIPOC faculty have to do while still being expected to teach the same number of classes, produce the same amount of research, and all of these things. And then also think about that non-tenure track people, because they have the added burden of no job security, less pay, and maybe less access. So specifically how this shows up is BIPOC faculty are asked to join all these committees, which puts them in places where they're being like rehashing all of these recommendations from years ago, maybe that they themselves gave, with no real structural change. They're being asked to be this diversity expert or diversity liaison. So, if there's a problem within the organization with a student and it somehow deals with race, you pass them off to this BIPOC faculty member. And so the administration thinks it's all good. You don't hear from it again, not realizing how much work that BIPOC faculty member is doing behind the scenes to keep things okay. And then you want to have this like good citizenship, right? You're trying to be a good citizenship towards your institution, doing all these things because part of you wants to help the institution, but also part of you might really like working with different communities that you represent. And so you might bring your institution all these rewards and accolades, but you're not getting those rewards. And those services aren't being recognized with your tenure and promotion. And then this thing about like refraining from speaking out about racism, except when specifically asked to teach all your colleagues about racism or to process current events with them, which gives you no space to process it and deal with it your own, and just dealing with colleagues and trying to teach them about racism. And then in the classroom, what we know, research shows that even without meeting a professor face-to-face, when provided identical qualifications, instructors identified as Black or Asian were rated less competent and less legitimate. Female instructors are going to be more negatively evaluated. But then also BIPOC faculty are going to be supporting marginalized students. So mentorship, advising, advocacy work, passing down knowledge that they've learned, and then also the teaching of multicultural courses. So the impacts on BIPOC faculty, administratively, viewing your department as indifferent or intentionally racist, rather than actually committed to diversity and multiculturalism. Because of all these added tasks, it really affects your promotion and tenure because you're working so hard on these other things. And then also BIPOC faculty just have less promotion clarity along every stage of academia. Personally, you have to deal with the stereotype threat, which occurs when a person is in a situation where they feel like they might confirm a stereotype about their in-group. So what this leads to is like extra collegiality. So like trying to make up for that by being extra nice. And even so, your BIPOC faculty are still seen as less friendly, less sociable, which leads to a decline in mental and physical health, burnout, isolation, and all these other things. So specifically in psychology, this comes up because in psychology, they tend to view race, ethnicity, diversity as a special interest topic outside of mainstream. So this othering of these things. When this work is published, work of white authors is disproportionately published over that of BIPOC authors. BIPOC authors who publish stuff about race and ethnicity are not as esteemed as white authors who do the same work. But then also it's important to highlight like what research in psychology really is. And the vast majority of research when it deals with faculty of color is about teaching effectiveness or teaching practices, survival skills, which basically emphasizes and normalizes individual actions to adapt to oppressive systems instead of trying to change the system itself. So specifically when we teach multicultural courses, the added burden with that specific course, on top of everything that I just discussed, is that usually a lot of programs have this like one course or maybe no course at all. But if there's that one course, you are tasked with teaching every single thing about diversity and multiculturalism in one specific course. That's it. It's just unmanageable. Sometimes professors are being sought after to teach these courses, but sometimes they're just voluntold to teach these courses. And obviously, faculty of color are going to be underrepresented across counseling and psychology programs, but overrepresented specifically for this course. You can go to the next slide. So specifically how this shows up is you have to deal with not only managing your own reactions, but also the reactions of your students. So you have to make this information palatable for them so that their reactions aren't extreme and you don't have to deal with the potential blowback of introducing this material. Faculty of color are going to have more negative evaluations when they teach this course compared to when white professors teach these courses, but generally this class is always going to have really bad evaluations across the board for students. But then, like I said, you're balancing your own emotional needs. You might have to use self-disclosure to talk about some of these topics, which makes you feel like you have to prove your reality for these students. And there's no blueprint to do this. So these faculty are being asked to learn how to do this on the fly and navigate all these oppressive dynamics just by themselves with no institutional or collegial support. So faculty, like I said, they're trying to make it palatable, but they're going to be provoked by privileged and white students. They're going to be devalued. They're going to be stereotyped. And it takes a significant emotional toll, and it leads to career stagnation because of it. And it's not just the day of, it's not just managing their reactions the day the class is taught. It's throughout the entire semester is thinking about this course. Without the support. And then there's the myth of what people call a safe space, which doesn't exist, especially in this course, because you have to realize that it's inherently violent and re-traumatizing for students of color to be in a place where they are being asked to either share things that they don't want to, or there's white students who are basically telling them that their experiences aren't valid or aren't real. And safe spaces aren't possible in this space because vulnerability is not going to be equal for all students in that classroom. So it's really important to kind of understand what that looks like for all students in that classroom, as well as the faculty person. And so research has shown that the level of safety experience is often dependent on the number of white students in class and their relative preparedness to engage in this course content. Next slide. There is the positive impact of teaching these courses. Faculty do want to be on the cutting edge. They do want to impact the profession at large, but also that personal conviction to make sure that my kids' friends are being able to have other psychologists who know how to do these things and can work with different people. There's also the fulfillment, satisfaction, and pride of being able to teach these courses and the connections you make with students. So those are all, there are benefits as well to teaching these courses. And then next slide. So just quick recommendations, there needs to be new training models for these classes. All faculty need to be able to be comfortable teaching these courses, which can reduce the burden on BIPOC faculty, as well as non-tenure track faculty. There needs to be changes in tenure practice in order to really make sure that these tasks, these burdens are positively rewarded within the tenure practice. But also simply acknowledging that it exists, asking for support and accountability from your institution, hiring faculty of color, retaining them, recruiting students of color, and all these things are important to start working towards. And next slide should be the project, which we're doing a project. It's really cool.
As we wait, just to let folks know, this is part of the Guskin grant. We're starting with this literature review that Dr. Baker and Natalie have done such a great job with. Next, we've got qualitative and possibly quantitative surveys that we'll be doing. Our IRB is already drafted and submitted, and hopefully we'll be moving to formal presentation and publication. The hope is that the focus will be on recommendations for administration to really be able to quantify, acknowledge, and support this BIPOC faculty burden.
So we do have one question now. Oh,
I was going to read it. So can you speak to how to support a BIPOC colleague who experiences burden from disconsciousness from BIPOC students? I would say it's hard to answer with it being so vague, but I think it's always important to ask, right? Like, what does that colleague need? I think is a really simple step you can take. But also, I think highlighting the importance of resistance and stepping back, because resistance to a system is okay, and that is valid. And resistance doesn't need to lead to direct change. So stepping back and resisting these things are still valid forms because you are reacting to survive. And so taking a step back can be really important and meaningful, but also just asking that colleague what they need.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, taking a look at the time, thank you so much for your presence and participation. And Dr. Baker, excellent job, totally killing it. And I think that's that. Thanks so much.